are you?
Good. Hi, Kyan. I'm doing well. How are you?
Things are good. Things are good. What day is today? Tuesday? Wednesday.
Today's
Wedne-
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
Yeah,
Yeah, there
you
was
went back in time.
no, there was free lunch today at work, so I know it's Wednesday.
Oh, nice, nice.
It's coming back to me. So, welcome back everybody. We're going to continue on our series of talking about outsourcing topics here on the Never Be Scared to Ask podcast.
Mhm,
Never be afraid to ask.
mhm.
Um, you'll have to work with my English. That it's not my first language. Having said that, we're going to talk about vendor selection today. And before I started the company, I had interviewed more than 50 heads of clinical operations, and it's I found a trend as to how people were selecting vendors. But better than how I can articulate it, I think Jaden, you could do a much better job. I think having been with the companies like Genentech and knowing how exactly you select vendors, what's been your experience been if somebody, let's say if I'm a CTM, I'm in my office, my boss comes to me, says we're going to start a phase 2 study next month. It's in oncology, it's a pediatric, and it's a rare disease, and we're going to do it in Latin America and let's say in North America and Europe. How would how should they go about finding a vendor,
Yeah.
or how do they do it right now?
I would go back to whoever's asking. So whether it's like the VP, director, whatever it is, to see if they have any vendors that they already have in mind. I think with the working relationships of vendors, it's like it's a very sensitive relationship, especially if depending on the size of the company. If the company is really small, you have very limited budget, so you want to choose wisely. So for somebody who's like a CTM positions, for example, I can't just go off and be like, okay, I'm just gonna Google some vendors for you. I would go back and ask the person who's in charge, like, do you have any vendors in mind? And if so, what are the contacts? Or if they don't have any contacts, I can do some digging. But otherwise, it's for me like understanding their expectations first before doing the search and waste my time. What about you? I mean, like for you, I feel like you have a very pretty deep knowledge in this because, like this is what your company does. So maybe you
Well,
could share
we
some
yeah,
insights.
we help select vendors by automating the process, but finding vendors itself, I've realized, is a very dangerous business to be in, because I don't think I've ever known of a sponsor who's happy with a vendor. So we keep away from recommending vendors. We are in the business of suggesting vendors if somebody asks for it, and we do it for free. We don't even charge them anything, because the whole point of the platform is to be democratic. But as much as to your point about you shouldn't go Google it, probably I'm confident that 95% of our listeners are doing exactly that.
Yeah.
Going to Google, because I don't think we have a better source than that, do we?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like for me, because I've worked at different sponsors, at different faces and whatnot for so long, that I have in my back pocket a kind of like a category of vendors to use. But let's say, somebody who is new to the industry, who doesn't even know anything, like how do you even look for that? Like how do you know if a vendor is actually that, a specific vendor that you Googled can actually service what you are looking for, right?
Yeah. And what do you think are the five top ways people select vendors as it stands right now?
Oh my God. I would say one is like Google and then word of mouth. If I don't know, like if I'm working on a child that, that disease area that I'm not familiar with, I would just talk to my colleagues from outside of the company to see if they've had any vendors that they've worked with before. Any prior experience, from your manager, from, anybody who's in the company. And if you're lucky enough to have like a procurement functions within the company, you can always reach out to these people.
No, no, I completely agree with that. I think we did a survey in about 2019, 2020 timeframe where we talked to a lot of heads of clinical operations. I think the top five things that came out of that, where one is word of mouth, Google, people that you worked with, look,
Mhm.
asking your LinkedIn network, etc. So there was no
Yeah.
scientific methodology that was used to select your vendors based on your requirements, which was your first point, going back to what you mentioned, which is when your boss asks you to select a vendor, the first question should be, what's our budget, what are our timelines, do we want to work with a small vendor or a large vendor, do we want
Yeah.
them to have rare disease experience,
Yeah.
which countries are we going in, are we okay working with multiple CROs, are we going to work with one CRO? I think these
Yeah.
are all questions that you may not have an answer for, but I think things at least that you should consider when you start your hunt, because if there is one predictor of on-time study completion, I believe that's selection of vendors, selection of the right vendors, both in terms of
Hmm.
price and quality.
Right.
Maybe I can share one of my experiences, and perhaps you can share one too, for the benefit of the audience. I have was supposed to select a central lab for Africa, for two of our phase 3 trials, and I did select a vendor. They were, I think they're within the top 10 central labs, and we ended up selecting one of them. Turns out they never had experience of working in Africa at all. So we've IORs, importer of records, they had absolutely no idea. They were working with another partner company of theirs, absolutely no coordination. And with over 20 years of 15 years of experience at that time, I think I still picked the wrong vendor. I had no idea I was doing it
Mm.
while I was doing it. So uh, yeah, I think there's no easy way of doing it, but I think I believe starting off with understanding what you need. So it's like the KFC rule: know what you want and find out what you're getting, and then change what you do until you get what you want. It's a simple way of a process that can be followed to identify the vendor. Easier said than done.
I love that though. I mean, the KFC rules, that's something that's my um point to remember of from today's conversation. Well, for me, I have a slightly different experience. So, when I was working on a phase 3 project, I came on board when the study has already started. So, all of the vendors were already selected. And one of the imaging vendors that they've selected is an academic institution. They don't have any infrastructures or setup to do what a central imaging lab was supposed to be doing. They cannot procure the data in a validated format for the study to do their analysis and whatnot. So it's sort of like my job to rescue this vendor. And how do I rescue it? I have to understand like what are they producing and how do I capture that data and save that data so that it's in a validated format. So at that point, it was already too late for us to like stop service at that vendor. So we had to do a kind of like a rescue service. So I have to bring in a data management company. I have to bring in a QA consultant just to make sure that this vendor is supported in the right way. And at the end of the day, like we were able to collect this data in a validated format, but instead of selecting one vendor and managing one vendor, I ended up having to manage three. Was it effective? After the rescue, it was. But before that, like just trying to understand what the process was and like why it was picked, and just go back and backtrack and make sure that everything is documented so that like if we're going to when we're going to submit to the FDA, like this data is usable and not just a waste of um, our resources. So yeah.
That's a good story. But going back to your what you said about the requirements, understanding the requirements of your study, how I don't know if you have any thoughts about how that can be converted into an RFP, or the process,
Mm.
because that I would think that's the next logical step once you decide which vendor to go with, at least even for the RFP process. Any thoughts on how you would go about in the RFP process?
Yeah, so I would say to go back to the RFI process first. For me, I want to do due diligence in terms of figuring out if this vendor can provide me with the service I need, the coverage I need. What is it going to be looking like? Like let's say, like we want to run like a US based study. Like if we don't need to go, like have a footprint of a global footprint, we can just use a smaller, CRO, for example. So I would request for information, have some conversations with them, bring it back to my internal team, present them with, the information that's provided and see what makes sense, what they want to pursue too. And then, like once we have kind of like a bucket of vendors that we are planning on pursuing, then I would move ahead with the RFP process.
That makes sense. I guess where I've worked, especially the smaller companies, I don't think we've had the time for an RFI, which can be a
Mhm.
huge process in itself. But I think having those initial discussions can be really helpful. helpful to your point. Maybe understanding what your most important top three criteria are, and confirming
Mm-hmm.
that these three vendors or these four vendors or five vendors, how many of them, how many ever that we're inviting to the RFP are at least meet those essential check um, check marks, whatever, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so that's one, and then I think you can start with the broader RFP process where you go into the details of the questions that you need to ask, etc. And maybe pick a couple of small ones, maybe a medium and a large one, just to get an idea of how much they charge, etc. And then coming up with all the details and sending the RFP out to the vendors would, is how I would approach it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that was good.
Yeah. I
Should
like
I
it.